If you have hazel eyes, there is a truth about your origin sitting in a file on chromosome 15, and the strange part is, no geneticist has ever been allowed to close that file. Every time they think they've read it in full, it contradicts itself again, the same way it has for over 10,000 years. Here is what that file actually contains. Feed a lab your DNA and ask it to predict brown eyes, and it will answer with something close to 95% confidence. Ask about blue, and the number barely moves. But ask about hazel, and the same equipment, the same reference panels, the same trained models, drop to somewhere between 50 and 80%. In forensic terms, that is not a weak signal. That is an inconclusive result, filed and left open, on a trait carried by roughly 1 in 20 people on the planet, and closer to 1 in 5 in parts of the United States. So before we go further, put the case on the table properly. Exhibit A is the color itself, if you can even call it that. A hazel iris is not one shade. It holds a ring of brown close to the pupil, then breaks outward into green, gold, sometimes copper, arranged differently in every person who has it. No two case files look alike. Photograph the same hazel eye in noon sun and in a dim room, and you will get two different exhibits from the same subject, which is exactly the kind of inconsistency that would get a human witness disqualified. Here, it is normal. It is the baseline. Exhibit B is the mechanism, and this is where the file gets its name. Two genes sit beside each other on chromosome 15, HERC2 and OCA2. Think of OCA2 as a factory that manufactures melanin for the iris, and HERC2 as the switch that decides how loud that factory is allowed to run. Full volume produces brown, nearly silent produces blue. Hazel is what happens when the switch lands in a position between the two. That would be a tidy answer, except the file has more witnesses on the stand. Genes named SLC24A, 4 and TYR fine-tune exactly where on the spectrum the color settles. TYRP1 decides the undertone, warm copper against cool jade. ASIP and IRF4 govern how unevenly the pigment sits inside the iris, which is the actual reason the color seems to shift with the room you're standing in. None of these genes act alone. They interact, suppress each other, override each other, in a pattern researchers call polygenic inheritance, meaning there is no single switch to point to. Nobody designed that middle setting. It is not a mutation with a clean origin story. It is closer to an ongoing dispute between several parties who never fully settle it. That is where the file should have closed. A single clean mutation, a name, a date, a place. It does not. Widen the search, and the dispute stops looking genetic and starts looking historical. Ancient DNA researchers examining more than 270 skeletons recovered across the Iberian Peninsula, spanning roughly 8,000 years, found a region that kept absorbing new arrivals rather than settling into one population. Call one of them Case Iberia. 3. A woman whose remains were recovered from a site dated to the early farming period, her genome carrying ancestry that had walked in from Anatolia, in what is now Turkey, layering itself over hunter-gatherer populations who had already lived there for millennia, and who, the evidence suggests, already carried a variant for lighter eyes. Neither population produced hazel on its own. It appears only after they meet, generation after generation, in the children caught between two extremes. Then a second party enters the record, and this one leaves a much rougher mark. Between roughly 2200 and 900 years before the Common Era, migrants moving out of the Pontic-Caspian steppe swept into the peninsula in numbers large enough to replace the majority of the male lineages that had existed there before. The Y chromosome markers that had dominated Iberia for millennia were pushed to the margins almost entirely, and a lineage called R1b, barely present before, now accounts for the paternal ancestry of most Iberian men alive today. That is not a quiet migration. That is a takeover, written into the chromosome and never erased. The chain of custody does not stop there. Branches of a lineage called E1, B1b, along with markers grouped under haplogroup J, still turn up in a meaningful minority of Iberian men today, roughly 1 in 10 to 1 in 6 depending on the region, carrying the signature of Phoenician, Levantine, and later North African contact. On the maternal side, a lineage called H dominates, tracing back to the earliest European farmers, while a separate marker, U6, traces directly to North African ancestry that crossed the strait and stayed. None of these lines canceled each other out, and none were quietly erased by the ones that followed. They stacked, one on top of the last, inside the same population, for thousands of years, and every layer is still readable today. Centuries later, Phoenician and Roman contact added further layers of Mediterranean ancestry, and beginning in the year 701, sustained movement of populations from North Africa introduced brown-eyed ancestry that mixed into the same gene pool for close to 800 years. Every one of those arrivals is still legible in the DNA of people living on that peninsula today. None of them knew they were building anything. They were only living, migrating, marrying. The case file was never meant to exist. It assembled itself by accident, one crossing at a time. That should be where this closes. Evidence gathered. Verdict returned. It is not. Here is the part the lab reports leave out. Even with every gene identified, even with the migration record reconstructed skeleton by skeleton, geneticists still cannot tell you from DNA alone which exact shade of hazel a given person will carry, or why the color shifts hour to hour. Some of that shift has an explanation worth trusting. The iris scatters light the same way the sky does, so a change in the light around you changes what bounces back toward the observer. Other claims attached to this case deserve more caution than they usually get. One early study suggested people with lighter eyes tolerate pain differently. It has never been replicated at a scale that would let a case file call it settled, so treat it as a lead, not a verdict. What does hold up under scrutiny is this. Brown eyes serve a clear purpose, blocking ultraviolet light in high sun environments. Blue eyes serve a different, equally clear purpose, letting in more light where the sun is scarce. Hazel does neither job cleanly. It sits in the gap between two settled arguments and never picks a side, which brings the file to its last open question, the one that outlives every witness who has ever testified in it. As populations keep mixing at a scale no ancestor of yours could have imagined, some geneticists argue this trait won't vanish so much as go underground, hiding behind more dominant genes for a generation or two before resurfacing, without warning, in a grandchild whose parents both had brown eyes. Others think it will simply become rarer, a genetic diamond scattered further and thinner across a world that no longer keeps its populations apart long enough to concentrate it anywhere. Nobody currently alive can tell you which of those futures is correct. Somewhere in the space between a brown-eyed argument and a blue-eyed one, on a stretch of chromosome 15 barely long enough to hold two genes, something kept the case open, on purpose or by accident, and the file has never once been marked closed. If you have hazel eyes, you are not looking at a color. You are looking at a case nobody has closed, and won't. Maybe for another 10,000 years.